Princess Charlotte Elizabeth Diana of Wales just stunned the entire United Kingdom by finally breaking her small, dignified silence at a private family luncheon inside Clarence House, calmly, quietly, and with the composure of a child 3 times her age, refusing to call Queen Camilla by the sacred word grandmother. The 9-year-old princess, long regarded as the softest, most watchful, most eerily perceptive child in the House of Windsor, the little girl with her great-grandmother's steel spine and her late grandmother Diana's oceanic eyes, has shattered decades of carefully rehearsed royal protocol with a single sentence spoken over a plate of untouched roasted lamb. What was meant to be an ordinary Sunday gathering, a soft-lit, unremarkable meal between 3 generations of the reigning family, spiraled within seconds into a suffocating, agonizing, cinematic standoff that left even the most seasoned Clarence House aides frozen in the corridor with trembling hands and pale, ashen faces. Because Charlotte, the guardian of a memory she was never supposed to inherit, the quiet loyalist of a woman who died 4 years before her own birth, had finally broken a solemn, unspoken vow, the vow every Wales child had been raised to keep. And she had been forced to break it by something devastating she had witnessed, something no one in that gilded dining room had realized she had seen. What exactly had little Charlotte overheard in the corridors of Windsor that autumn afternoon 3 months earlier? Why had Catherine, Princess of Wales, explicitly forbidden any member of the household from ever using the word grandmother in front of the child, until Charlotte herself was ready? And what dark, hidden family tragedy, buried beneath 27 years of palace machinery and choreographed reconciliation, had finally compelled a 9-year-old girl to stand her ground against the most powerful woman in Britain? The dining room at Clarence House on that pale, frost-touched Sunday afternoon in late November was, by every outward measure, a portrait of domestic royal serenity. The mullioned windows, tall and narrow and rimmed with the last of the season's ivy, filtered a thin cream-colored light onto the mahogany dining table that had been polished that morning by 3 separate footmen. A low arrangement of white gardenias, Diana's flower, though no one in the room dared name it aloud, sat centered on the table, their scent drifting through the still, suffocating air like a ghost that refused to leave. The Persian rug beneath the table, deep crimson and threaded with faded gold, muffled every footstep. A grandfather clock in the far corner ticked with the slow, deliberate patience of something that had witnessed a great deal and would witness a great deal more. Van Dyck's portrait of a long-dead duchess watched from above the fireplace, her painted eyes catching the light in a way that made her seem, on that particular afternoon, unusually attentive. Dust motes danced in the shafts of pale sunlight, a single log crackled in the marble hearth, and on the table beside Charlotte's place setting, placed there by the child herself, though no one had noticed at the time, sat a small cream-colored envelope, its edges softened by handling, sealed with a faded crimson wax impression bearing the unmistakable crest of a swallow in flight. The envelope was addressed, in a child's careful looping hand, to no one in particular, and it would not be opened for another 47 minutes. Catherine, Princess of Wales, sat to her daughter's right, dressed in a soft camel-wool dress, her chestnut hair pulled back in the low, unfussy chignon she favored on private family days. She had noticed, of course, that Charlotte had been unusually quiet during the drive from Kensington. She had noticed, too, that the little girl had insisted, with a firmness quite unlike her, on carrying her own small leather satchel into the house, and had refused, politely but immovably, to hand it over to the equerry at the door. William, Prince of Wales, sat across from his wife, his jaw set in that particular way that betrayed a private tension he had not yet named. And at the head of the table, poised and gracious and impeccable in a dove-gray cashmere twin set, sat Queen Camilla, pouring tea from a silver pot with the practiced ease of a woman who had spent the better part of 5 decades learning to appear utterly at ease. King Charles, who had been due to attend, had been called away that morning to a matter concerning the duchy, a small mercy, as it would turn out. George, 11 and increasingly grown into his role as heir's heir, was seated beside his father, methodically working through his lamb with the joyless efficiency of a boy who had learned early that royal luncheons were something to be endured. Louis, mercifully, was upstairs with his nanny. And so it was Charlotte, small, upright, her hair in the 2 neat plaits her mother had woven that morning, her dark green cardigan buttoned to the throat, who found herself seated directly opposite the Queen Consort of the United Kingdom. And it was Charlotte who, when Camilla leaned forward with a warm, practiced smile and said, "Come now, darling, you've barely touched your lunch, won't you eat a little something for grandmama?" set down her small silver fork with the softest, most deliberate click, folded her hands in her lap, looked the Queen directly in the eye, and said, in a voice quiet and clear and entirely without malice, "You are not my grandmother." The silence that followed was not ordinary silence. It was the kind of silence that has weight, that has temperature, that seems to press down on the shoulders and the sternum and the back of the throat. The grandfather clock ticked, the log in the hearth popped. A footman in the corridor beyond the dining room, holding a tray of clean water glasses, froze mid-step and would later confess to his wife that he had felt, in that moment, as though the very floor of Clarence House had tilted beneath him. Catherine's teacup paused halfway to her lips. William's hand, resting on the stem of his wine-glass, went suddenly and visibly white at the knuckles. George looked up from his plate for the first time in 20 minutes. And Camilla, who had weathered the tabloids of the 90s, who had stood beside Charles through the annus horribilis and the divorce and the death and the long cold decades of public rehabilitation, who had learned to smile through venom that would have flattened any ordinary woman. Camilla did not flinch. She did not blink. She simply set the teapot down with a small, precise chime of silver on porcelain, and said, very softly, I see. For 27 years, the world has spoken for Diana, Princess of Wales. Today, in the quietest, gentlest, most devastating way imaginable, her 9-year-old granddaughter was speaking for her. And somewhere in a small, sparsely furnished office 2 floors above the dining room, a senior member of the household, a man in a charcoal suit and polished Oxford shoes, a man whose name will not appear in any official record of that afternoon, a man who had served the institution for 31 years, and who had made it his private, meticulous business to know every conversation, every letter, every whispered exchange within the walls of the royal residences, set down a manila folder on his desk, and permitted himself, for the first time in his career, a single sharp intake of breath, because the child had done exactly what he had been quietly working for 8 years to prevent. The flashback that rose, unbidden, in Catherine's mind at that precise moment, was one she had not permitted herself to revisit in nearly 4 years. It was the spring of 2021. Charlotte had been 5 years old. The gardens at Anmer Hall had been in their first tender bloom, the scent of hyacinths and cut grass drifting through the open windows of the nursery. Catherine had been sorting through a small mahogany box of Diana's personal effects, a box William had inherited from his father's private safe, a box that had remained sealed for over 2 decades. Inside, wrapped in tissue paper the color of old ivory, had been a small silver locket engraved with a swallow in flight. Charlotte had wandered into the room barefoot, her nightgown trailing behind her, and had stopped very still at the sight of the locket. "Mummy," she had said, in the grave, considering voice she had used even at that age. "Who did that belong to?" And Catherine, kneeling on the nursery floor with her hand suddenly trembling, had answered, "It belonged to Granny Diana, your daddy's mummy." Charlotte had reached out with one small, deliberate finger, and touched the silver swallow, and then she had said, in that same considered voice, "I think she wants me to have it." Catherine had not known, in that moment, whether to laugh or weep. She had done neither. She had simply fastened the locket around her daughter's neck, and on impulse, had made her a promise, a solemn, whispered, mother-to-daughter promise she had never told William about. "No one," she had said, "will ever make you call anyone else that name, unless you want to. Do you understand me, my darling? Not ever." Charlotte had nodded once, the swallow catching the spring light, and the promise had been made. Back in the dining room at Clarence House, Camilla's hand had returned, quite steady, to her lap. William was staring at his daughter with an expression that hovered somewhere between horror and a strange dawning painful pride. Catherine had reached, very slowly, for her daughter's hand beneath the table, and had found Charlotte's small fingers already waiting for hers, calm and warm, and entirely unafraid. "Charlotte," William said at last, his voice careful, controlled, the voice of a man who had spent his entire adult life learning to modulate emotion in front of witnesses. That was not kind, darling. Camilla is—" But Charlotte, who had been raised by Catherine to speak the truth softly but to speak it nonetheless, interrupted her father with the gentlest imaginable shake of her head. "I didn't say it to be unkind, Papa," she said. "I said it because it's true. Granny Diana is my grandmother. I only have one." And she looked, then, not at William, not at her mother, but directly at Camilla, and her small face, framed by those 2 neat plaits, was not angry. It was not defiant. It was, if anything, sorrowful. "I like you," Charlotte said to the Queen, with a courtesy that was almost unbearable. "I think you are very kind to Papa, but I cannot call you what she was. I'm sorry." The trap, 27 years in the making, had just been sprung, and it had been sprung not by the palace machinery, not by the men in gray, not by the ruthless apparatus that had spent nearly 3 decades choreographing the rehabilitation of Camilla Parker Bowles into Queen Camilla of the United Kingdom, but by a 9-year-old girl in a green cardigan who had inherited more than her grandmother's eyes. Upstairs, the man in the charcoal suit picked up the antique rotary telephone on his desk, the black one, the private line, the one that connected directly to 3 other identical telephones in 3 other palaces, and dialed a number he had committed to memory over 3 decades ago. The receiver was answered on the second ring. "It's happened," he said, in a voice stripped of all inflection. "The Wales girl. At luncheon." She said it aloud. There was a pause on the other end of the line. And then the voice, greyly, weighted, older than the man in the charcoal suit by a full generation, said only, "How much does the child know?" The man in the charcoal suit looked down at the manila folder on his desk, at the 8-year-old surveillance log that lay within it, at the entry from October the 14th of the previous year, the entry that recorded, in cold typewritten prose, that Princess Charlotte had been observed, at Windsor Castle, standing motionless in the corridor outside the Queen's private drawing room for approximately 11 minutes. Standing, and listening. "More," he said quietly, "than we thought." The flashback that surfaced now, not in Catherine's mind, but in the mind of William, Prince of Wales, seated frozen at the Clarence House dining table, was from August of 1997. He had been 15 years old. He had been standing barefoot on the cold flagstone floor of a corridor at Balmoral, wearing striped pajamas that were slightly too short for him, having been woken by the sound of a telephone ringing at 4 in the morning. He had heard his father's voice from behind a closed door, cracked, choked, unrecognizable. He had heard, further down the corridor, a woman weeping. He had not known, in that moment, whether the woman was his grandmother or Camilla or someone else entirely. But he had known, with the terrible clarity of a 15-year-old boy who has just lost his mother, that from that moment forward there would be two categories of people in his life: those who had loved Diana, and those who had not. And he had made himself a promise he had, over the intervening 27 years, quietly and shamefully and repeatedly broken, that he would never allow anyone to make his own children forget her. He looked now at his daughter, and he understood, with a jolt that went through him like an electric current, that Charlotte had not forgotten. Charlotte, who had never met Diana, who had been born 14 years after Diana's death, who knew her grandmother only from photographs and from a silver locket and from the stories her mother had told her at bedtime, Charlotte had not forgotten. She was, in fact, the only person at the table who was still remembering with any honesty at all. Catherine rose from her chair. Her movement was smooth, unhurried, entirely composed, the movement of a woman who had spent 12 years learning to carry herself through moments precisely like this one. "Camilla," she said, and her voice was warm, and gentle, and inflexible. "I think Charlotte and I will take a short walk in the garden, if you'll excuse us." It was not a request. Camilla, whose composure had never once in 50 years failed her in public, inclined her head with a small tight smile. "Of course, my dear," she said. "Take all the time you need." William watched his wife and daughter leave the room with the small cream-colored envelope, which Charlotte had retrieved from beside her plate and clutched now against the front of her green cardigan. He did not know yet what was inside it. He would know within the hour. The gardens behind Clarence House in late November are severe and beautiful in the way that only English aristocratic gardens can be. The box hedges clipped to geometric precision, the gravel paths raked that morning by an under-gardener, the great copper beech at the eastern end of the lawn stripped now of its leaves and standing black against the pale winter sky. Catherine led her daughter down the central path, past the empty stone urns and the frost-covered rosebeds, until they reached the small wrought-iron bench beneath the beech where, 20 years earlier, a very young Prince William had once sat and wept into his own mother's shoulder on a summer afternoon no one had ever photographed. Catherine sat, Charlotte sat beside her, and for a long moment, neither of them spoke. "Show me, darling," Catherine said at last, very softly. Charlotte handed her the envelope without a word. Catherine turned it over in her gloved hands. The crimson wax seal, cracked slightly at the edge from having been carried in a satchel, bore the small, unmistakable impression of a swallow in flight, the same swallow that hung, at that moment, on a silver chain beneath Charlotte's cardigan. Catherine's breath caught. "Where did you find this, my love?" Charlotte was silent for a moment. Then she said, "In the drawer of the little writing desk in the corner of Granny Elizabeth's private drawing room, the one no one uses anymore." Catherine closed her eyes. She had not been in that room since the late Queen's death. She had not known, until this moment, that her 9-year-old daughter had been. "When?" she whispered. "October," Charlotte said. "When we visited Windsor. I was looking for the cat. I heard voices. I stopped." She looked up at her mother with those enormous, sorrowful, oceanic eyes. "Mummy," she said, "I heard them talking about Granny Diana, about how she was, how she had been, inconvenient." That was the word the man in the gray suit used, inconvenient. Catherine's hand tightened on the envelope. "And Camilla?" she asked, though she already knew the answer. "Camilla was in the room," Charlotte said quietly. "She didn't say anything, but she didn't tell the man to stop either. And after he left, she laughed, just a little, just once." The cracking of the wax seal, When Catherine finally broke it open with her thumbnail there on the wrought iron bench beneath the copper beech, was the softest imaginable sound, and yet it seemed, to both of them, to echo across the garden and the palace and the whole of the United Kingdom. Inside the envelope was a single sheet of pale blue writing paper, folded twice. And on that paper, in a handwriting that Catherine recognized instantly, a handwriting she had studied in 100 private letters kept in a locked drawer at Kensington, a handwriting that had haunted William through every one of the 27 years since, was a letter dated the 14th of August, 1997, 2 weeks before Paris, 2 weeks before the tunnel, 2 weeks before the world had ended for two small boys in striped pajamas standing barefoot on flagstone floors. The letter was addressed to my darling granddaughter, whoever you may one day be. Catherine's hands began to shake. Inside the drawing room at Clarence House, Camilla had not moved from her chair. William sat opposite her, his wine untouched, his face the color of old parchment. George had been quietly excused and had disappeared upstairs with a footman. It was just the two of them now, the son of Diana and the woman who had, for the whole of his conscious life, occupied the space in his father's heart that had never quite belonged to her. "William," Camilla said at last, and her voice was not the voice of a queen. It was the voice of a 67-year-old woman who was suddenly, unmistakably tired. "I want you to know that I have never in all these years asked her to call me anything at all. Not grandmother, not Camilla, not anything. I have left it entirely to her." William nodded slowly. He believed her. That was, in some ways, the most painful part. "I know, Camilla," he said. "I know you haven't." "Then who?" Camilla began, and then stopped, because she had understood, in the same instant, exactly who. The man in the charcoal suit, the man upstairs, the man who had for 8 years been gently and persistently and invisibly suggesting to household staff, to nannies, to tutors, to visiting cousins, that it would be so much simpler, so much kinder, so much more unifying, if the Wales children would only in time come to use the word. The man who had authored the memos, the man who had drafted the language, the man who had, without ever once consulting the Queen Consort herself, made it his private mission to close at last the final open wound of the House of Windsor. "Oh, William," Camilla said very softly. "Oh, William. I never asked him to do that. You must believe me. I never asked." William looked at her for a long moment, and then, to his own astonishment, he reached across the table and took her hand. "I know, Camilla," he said. "I know. 20 million people were not watching this. No cameras had been permitted inside Clarence House that afternoon. No servants would ever speak of what they had seen. And yet, somehow, across the country, in pubs in Edinburgh where the early evening football was on, in kitchens in Cardiff where mothers were making tea, in living rooms in Belfast and Newcastle and Cornwall, a strange, unaccountable stillness had begun to settle. A feeling, unspoken and unnamed, that something inside the royal family had just quietly and irrevocably shifted. The palace switchboards, though no bulletin had been issued, had begun to receive calls. The press office at Buckingham had been briefed to say, if asked, no comment. The men in grey, in their charcoal suits and their polished Oxford shoes, were already convening in a small wood-panelled room on the second floor of a building in central London that does not appear on any tourist map. They were cornered, and they knew it. The letter, in Catherine's trembling hands beneath the copper beech, read as follows. "My darling granddaughter, whoever you may one day be, I do not know your name. I do not know the color of your hair, or your eyes, or whether you will have your father's laugh, or your uncle's stubbornness, or something entirely your own. I do not know whether you will read this letter when you are 5, or 15, or 50. But I am writing it tonight because I have a feeling, my darling, that I may not be here to tell you these things myself. I want you to know 3 things. The first is that I loved your father and your uncle more than my own life. And if you are reading this, it means one of them became your papa, and that fills me with such joy I can hardly bear it. The second is that you must never ever let anyone tell you who to love or what to call them. Titles are for palaces, names are for people, and the people who love you will not need to be given a title in order for you to know them. The third is that there will be, in the years to come, people around the family who will try very hard, very kindly, very reasonably, to smooth over the things that hurt. They will call it healing. They will call it moving on. My darling, some things are not meant to be smoothed over. Some things are meant to be remembered exactly as they were. You do not owe anyone your forgetting. Be kind, be gentle, be as generous as your father has taught you to be. But do not, my darling, let them make you forget me. I will be a swallow, wherever you are, whatever room you walk into, whatever name they try to give the woman who sits where I should have sat. I will be the swallow at the window. Look for me. I will always be there. All my love, Forever and ever and one day more, Granny. Catherine wept silently onto the pale blue paper. Charlotte did not weep. Charlotte simply reached up and took her mother's hand, and said very quietly, "It's all right, Mummy. She isn't sad. She's just glad someone finally heard her." The letter had not been planted. It had not been fabricated. It had been written, as forensic examination would later confirm through handwriting analysis, ink dating, and the recovered watermark of the Kensington Palace stationery of 1997, by Diana, Princess of Wales, on the 14th of August of that year, and it had been placed, along with 3 other letters addressed to unborn grandchildren, in a small mahogany box that Diana had entrusted, on the eve of her final holiday, to her mother-in-law, Queen Elizabeth II. The late Queen had kept the box, unopened and undisturbed, in the drawer of a writing desk in her private drawing room at Windsor for the remaining 70 years of her life. She had never mentioned it to Charles. She had never mentioned it to William. She had apparently been waiting. Waiting for the right child. Waiting for the right moment. Waiting perhaps for a small girl looking for a cat to wander into a room she was not meant to be in, and to hear a man in a gray suit use a word that she would carry, silent and burning, for 6 weeks. The encrypted satellite phone in Catherine's coat pocket vibrated. She wiped her eyes, drew it out, and saw the name on the screen. "Harry. Calling from Montecito," she answered. "Kate," her brother-in-law said, and his voice was the broken, cracked sob of a 15-year-old boy in striped pajamas on a flagstone floor. "Kate, is it true? Did she really?" Catherine looked at her daughter, sitting beside her on the wrought iron bench, the silver swallow now visible outside the collar of the green cardigan. "Yes, Harry," she said. "It's true, every word." There was a long silence on the line. And then Harry, 3,000 miles away in the California hills, said the only thing that could be said. "Then she did it," he whispered. "She did what none of us could do. She saved her." The consequences moved fast. By 6 o'clock that evening, before the news bulletins had run, before a single tabloid had been briefed, before even King Charles had returned from the duchy, the man in the charcoal suit had been quietly summoned to a small office in Buckingham Palace, and had been informed, by a courtier senior even to himself, that his services would no longer be required. He would receive a full pension. He would sign a comprehensive non-disclosure agreement. He would, from that afternoon forward, cease to exist as far as the institution was concerned. His files, 8 years of memoranda regarding the Wales children, 3 decades of internal correspondence regarding the reputational management of the late Princess of Wales, a private log of surveillance activities that had never been authorized in writing by any member of the family, would be transferred to a secure archive and sealed for 100 years. He was permitted to keep his charcoal suit and his polished Oxford shoes. He was permitted nothing else. William made that decision himself, at 7 o'clock that evening, sitting in his father's study at Clarence House, with his wife on one side of him and his daughter on the other. Charles, when he returned, was told everything. He wept. He asked to see the letter. Catherine, after a long look at Charlotte, permitted it. Charles read it in silence, his hands shaking as his mother's hands had once shaken, and when he had finished he folded it very carefully, and returned it to his granddaughter, and said only, in a voice that had been stripped of sovereign authority, and reduced to that of a 76-year-old son, "She was right. She was always right. I am so sorry, my darling. I am so terribly sorry." Charlotte, who had been raised to speak the truth softly but to speak it nonetheless, reached up and put her small hand on her grandfather's cheek and said, "It's all right, Grandpapa. She isn't cross. She just wanted to be remembered." That evening, upstairs in the small guest bedroom Charlotte had been given at Clarence House, Camilla knocked very quietly at the door. Catherine opened it. The 2 women looked at each other for a long moment, the 2 women who had, in their entirely different ways, spent their entire adult lives being defined by their proximity to Diana, and Camilla said softly, "May I speak with her? For a moment only." "I will not. I would not." Catherine stepped aside. Camilla went in. Charlotte was sitting on the edge of the bed, still in her green cardigan, the silver swallow around her neck, the pale blue letter refolded in her lap. Camilla sat down beside her, keeping a careful, respectful distance. "Charlotte," she said, "I want you to know that I never wanted you to call me anything you didn't want to call me. Not ever. Do you understand?" Charlotte nodded. "I know that now," she said. "Papa told me." Camilla looked at her hands. Then she looked at the small, grave, oceanic-eyed girl beside her. "I loved your grandfather very much, you see," she said, "for a very long time. And I know that caused a great deal of pain. To your grandmother, to your father, to your uncle. I have lived with that pain, in my own way, for all of my life. I do not ask you to forgive me for it. I only ask that you know I never meant to take her place. Not with you. Not with anyone." Charlotte was quiet for a long moment. And then, in the gentle, considered voice that had, that afternoon, brought down a 30-year machinery of institutional silence, she said, "I don't hate you, Camilla. I never did. I have a grandmother, and she is a swallow, and she is at the window. And I can't pretend she isn't, even to be kind. Do you understand?" Camilla, to her enormous credit, did not weep. She simply nodded once and said, "Yes, my darling, I understand. And I think she was very lucky to have you, even if she never got to meet you." Charlotte considered this, and then she said, "You can be my friend if you like. That's a different thing. That isn't a title. That's just a name for a person who is kind." Camilla, for the first time in a very long time, smiled a smile that had nothing rehearsed in it at all. "I should like that very much," she said. "I should like that very much indeed." The pale blue letter was placed, that night, in the small mahogany box that had once belonged to Diana, along with the silver swallow locket, which Charlotte had, of her own accord, unclasped from her neck and laid gently on top of the folded paper. The box was carried the following morning to Kensington Palace, where it was placed in a locked cabinet in Catherine's private study, alongside the other letters Diana had left for grandchildren she would never meet. Letters that would be given, in time, to George, and to Louis, and to Harry's children in California, each in the moment when that child was ready to receive them. The swallow locket Charlotte would receive back on her 16th birthday. That, too, had been in Diana's letter. Catherine had not mentioned it. She had not needed to. Some things, as Diana had written, are meant to be remembered exactly as they were. The palace made no statement. The tabloids received no briefing. No leak was ever traced, though the country somehow knew, in that quiet, unaccountable way that countries sometimes know things about their royal families, that something inside the House of Windsor had, at long last, been set gently and permanently to rest. The men in grey convened one final time, in the small wood-panelled room in central London, and dispersed without conclusion. Their apparatus had been dismantled from the inside, not by scandal, not by press exposure, not by an angry prince or a wounded princess, but by a 9-year-old girl in a green cardigan, who had done nothing more than tell the truth softly at Sunday luncheon. Buckingham Palace, when finally pressed for comment 3 days later by a persistent correspondent from a Sunday broadsheet, replied only, "The family enjoyed a private luncheon. No further comment will be offered." And that, in the end, was that. On the drive back to Kensington that evening, Charlotte fell asleep in the car with her head against her mother's shoulder. Catherine stroked her daughter's hair and watched the London streets slide past the window, the lamplights and the winter mist, and the great pale dome of St. Paul's rising in the distance, and thought about a promise she had made in a nursery at Anmere Hall 4 years earlier, and about a woman she had never met, who had written a letter one August evening in 1997, and about the strange, unfathomable way that love, if it is real enough, will find its way through 27 years and 3 generations and every institutional machinery ever devised by man to arrive, at last, in the small folded hands of the child who needs it most. William, driving, reached across and took his wife's hand. He did not speak. He did not need to. Somewhere above them, in the pale winter sky over central London, a single small bird, improbable in that season, impossible in that hour, cut a swift, sudden arc across the darkening horizon, and was gone. The broadcast, had there been a broadcast, would have cut to black. The truth had saved her boys. The truth had saved her granddaughter. The swallow had finally flown free. And somewhere in a small, sparsely furnished office in a building that does not appear on any tourist map, a manila folder sat unopened on an empty desk. The charcoal suit hung neatly in a wardrobe that would not be opened again. And the ticking of a clock that had measured out 3 decades of institutional cruelty fell, for the first time in a very long time, into a silence that no one was left to hear. The secret was out. The child had spoken. And Diana, Princess of Wales, at long last, was resting.